It was supposed to be just another warm afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Maple Ridge. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. The hum of sprinklers echoed through rows of white picket fences, and children's laughter usually danced through the streets. But on that particular day, a scream cut through the calm like a siren. A little girl, about 8 years old, light-skinned with soft curls and a pink backpack hanging loosely from her shoulder, came running down the block, her sobs echoing across the neat lawns. She was barefoot, her knees scraped, and her tiny hands trembled as she clutched her mother's dress. "Mama, they're beating me," she cried, her words cracked with terror. Her mother, Denise Carter, a 34-year-old black woman who had lived in that neighborhood for barely 6 months, froze for a heartbeat. Her garden hose slipped from her hand, water spraying wildly as she dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter close. At first, Denise thought maybe it was just kids being cruel, a playground fight gone wrong. But then she saw it. Red marks across her daughter's arm, dirt smeared down her cheek, and the unmistakable shoe print pressed faintly against her shirt. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The other children stood across the street, whispering, pointing, their faces pale, guilty, and scared. Behind them, a tall man in a baseball cap, one of the neighbors, watched silently from his porch. His eyes met Denise's, cold and unbothered, like he already knew this would happen. In that instant, Denise understood something every black parent fears when they move into certain neighborhoods, that no matter how clean your home, how polite your words, or how kind your heart, some people will always see you and your children as intruders. Her daughter's cries broke again. "Mama, they said I don't belong here." Denise rose slowly, her tears turning to fire. She had faced racism before, but never like this. And she was about to show the entire neighborhood that this time they had chosen the wrong mother to test. Denise Carter had always believed in giving her daughter, Ava, the life she never had. Growing up in the rougher parts of Detroit, she'd seen how poverty and prejudice could box people in. Every decision she made, every overtime shift at the hospital, every dollar she saved, was to build a life that felt safe, stable, and full of opportunity. When she finally bought the cozy 3-bedroom house in Maple Ridge, it felt like she had won her own quiet revolution. The neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and polite smiles, seemed like the perfect place to raise a child. The realtor had described it as diverse and family-friendly, though Denise quickly realized that diverse meant one black family among hundreds of white ones. Still, she chose hope over fear. She told herself that time and kindness could soften even the coldest stares. Ava, with her curious eyes and boundless joy, adjusted quickly, or so Denise thought. Every morning, she'd skip to the bus stop in her neat little uniform, waving goodbye with her backpack bouncing behind her. But small cracks began to appear in that perfect picture. First, it was the whispers. A few of the neighborhood moms at the park would fall silent when Denise approached. Their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. The playdates Ava was invited to suddenly stopped after the second week. When Denise asked one mother if Ava had done something wrong, she received a polite, clipped response. "Oh, we just have a different circle." Then came the school. Ava had always been bright, ahead in reading, quick with math, endlessly curious. But one day, she came home quiet, her usual chatter replaced by a kind of heavy silence that didn't belong on a child. Denise pressed gently until Ava admitted that a few classmates had started teasing her. They called her dirty, said her hair looked like steel wool, and refused to sit next to her at lunch. Denise's heart broke that night. She tried to hide her tears as she braided Ava's hair, telling her how beautiful and strong she was. But the ache didn't fade. The next morning, she went straight to the principal's office. The meeting was polite, painfully polite. The principal, a middle-aged man named Mr. Halverson, nodded with practiced concern. "We take all reports seriously," he said, his pen scratching across a pad without much meaning. "We'll look into it." But nothing changed. Weeks passed, and the bullying only grew worse. Denise found Ava's drawings filled with dark clouds, tears, and stick figures standing alone. She started to dread each day's end, waiting by the window to see her daughter come home safe. Still, she held her faith in the system, in decency, in the idea that good people would do the right thing if they only knew. She joined the PDA, volunteered at bake sales, and smiled with judgment that lingered in every glance. But the day Ava ran home crying, barefoot and broken, all that faith shattered. After holding her daughter for what felt like hours, Denise cleaned her wounds and listened carefully. Ava explained that a group of older kids from down the street, children of one of their neighbors, had cornered her behind the playground. They'd called her names again, told her to go back where she came from, and when she tried to walk away, one of them shoved her to the ground. When Denise asked who it was, Ava hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the house across the street. The one with the American flag flying proudly in the blue neighborhood watch sticker on a mailbox. That house belonged to Greg and Sandra Miller, one of the first families to welcome Denise to the neighborhood. Greg was the man she'd seen standing on his porch earlier, watching without a word. That night, as Denise tucked Ava into bed, she sat in the dark lawn after her daughter fell asleep. Outside her window, the sprinklers clicked on, watering the same lawns that had once made her feel proud to live there. Now, they felt like a reminder of the price of peace and the silence that protects cruelty. Denise knew she had a choice. She could let this break her spirit, or she could fight, not just for Ava, but for every mother who had ever been told to let it go. And deep down, she already knew which path she would take. The next morning, the world outside seemed painfully ordinary. Birds chirping, engines starting, and joggers pacing the clean, familiar streets. But inside Denise's home, something had shifted. The quiet calm was gone. What replaced it was a burning, calculated resolve. She packed Ava's lunch, brushed her curls, and walked her to the bus stop. The same group of neighborhood children stood nearby with their parents, and when Denise approached, their conversations faltered. Eyes avoided hers. One mother offered a weak smile that didn't hold. Denise stood tall, holding Ava's hand just a little tighter. When the bus pulled up, she kissed her daughter on the forehead and whispered, "Hold your head high, baby. You did nothing wrong." As the bus disappeared down the street, Denise turned and locked eyes with Greg Miller across the road. He was leaning on his porch railing, coffee mug in hand, wearing that same smug smirk that had haunted her since yesterday. He didn't need to say a word. His silence screamed louder than anything. It said, "You don't belong here, and we'll remind you of it." But Denise wasn't the same woman who'd moved to Maple Ridge 6 months ago, hoping to fit in. She'd seen the truth of it now, and she was ready to fight it on every front. That day, instead of heading to work, Denise called in a personal day and drove straight to the elementary school. She arrived unannounced, her calm presence masking the storm inside her. When she stepped into the front office, the secretary looked startled. Denise politely but firmly asked to see the principal. The same man who had once brushed her concerns aside now looked uncomfortable as she laid a stack of photographs, notes, and bruises in front of him. Denise had spent half the night documenting every mark, every detail Ava had described. Her voice was steady. No shouting, no pleading, just facts. "These children didn't just tease my daughter," she said quietly. "They assaulted her on school grounds, and I'm not leaving until this is properly addressed." The principal shifted uneasily. He mumbled about policy and ongoing investigations, about how kids can be cruel and these things happen. Denise leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "You don't get to dismiss this as a playground accident. My daughter was targeted because of her race, and you're going to do something about it, or I will." For the first time, he had no reply. Over the next few days, whispers spread through the school. Some parents sided quietly with Denise, but many didn't. Rumors began that she was overreacting, that she was making everything about race. She saw the posts on the neighborhood Facebook group, thinly veiled comments about people who move in and cause trouble. The real blow came that weekend. Denise woke up early to mow her lawn, only to find a crude word scrawled in black spray painted across her white garage door. "Go back." The can dropped from her hand. Her stomach turned. Ava, standing behind her in pajamas, gasped before Denise could shield her eyes. For a moment, time froze. The bright suburban sun, the chirping birds, everything became mockingly normal, as if the world refused to acknowledge her pain. By the time the police arrived, Greg Miller was already outside again, pretending to water his plants. He looked over with feigned sympathy. "Such a shame," he said loud enough for the officers to hear. "Maybe some teenagers, you know how they are." The officer nodded without much interest. "We'll file a report," he said flatly, jotting notes like a man counting minutes until lunch. "If anything else happens, give us a call." Denise watched as they left. No fingerprints taken, no urgency, no real concern. It was the same story she'd seen before, just dressed in a cleaner zip code. That night, as Ava slept clutching her teddy bear, Denise sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the hateful message still faintly visible on her garage door. Every fiber of her being screamed for justice, but she knew that in a world built to silence women like her, justice wasn't given. It was made, so she began to plan. She started by documenting everything: dates, times, photos, conversations. She reached out to a civil rights attorney she knew from her volunteer work years ago, explaining the situation in detail. The lawyer listened quietly and then said the words Denise needed to hear. "Don't let them scare you into silence. Let's make noise." In the days that followed, Denise filed official complaints against the school, the HOA, and even the local police department. She posted Ava's story on social media. Carefully written, respectful, but raw and undeniable. The post went viral overnight. Thousands of comments poured in from mothers, teachers, and people who had lived that same nightmare of being the only one in a place that looked at them like a stain. Local news stations picked it up next. Reporters showed up in the neighborhood, cameras flashing as they asked questions nobody wanted to answer. The school scrambled to issue a statement about inclusivity and investigation. The HOA released a letter condemning all acts of vandalism without ever mentioning racism. And through it all, Greg Miller glared from across the street, his perfect world cracking at the edges. But the real change came when other parents began to speak. One mother admitted she'd heard her son say cruel things about Ava, but hadn't corrected him. Another confessed that the same group of boys had bullied a Latino child a year before. The facade of Maple Ridge, the clean, perfect all-American neighborhood, began to crumble under the weight of truth. Denise didn't celebrate. Not yet, because she knew the hardest part was still to come. The moment when those who had once hidden behind silence would be forced to face what they'd allowed to happen. By the end of the week, Maple Ridge didn't look like the same neighborhood. News vans lined the curbs. Reporters walked door to door, and whispers floated through the air like smoke. For the first time, the white fences and smiling facades couldn't hide the truth. Something rotten had been festering beneath their perfect lawn for years. Denise stood by her window, watching as one of the local reporters interviewed a woman 2 houses down. The woman's face was tight with discomfort. "We're not racist," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "We just don't like people who bring drama." Denise shook her head slowly. "Drama," she murmured under her breath. "That's what they call justice when it makes them uncomfortable." Her phone vibrated on the counter. It was her lawyer, a calm, assured woman named Carla Johnson. She had good news. The school district had agreed to a meeting with Denise, the superintendent, and the parents of the children involved. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a start. Denise agreed immediately. The meeting was set for following Monday. When she arrived that morning, she felt a mixture of dread and strength. Ava stayed home from school, curled up with her grandmother on FaceTime for comfort. Denise wore a simple black blazer and walked through the double doors of Maple Ridge Elementary with her head high. She wasn't there to beg or to argue. She was there to demand accountability. Inside the conference room, tension sat heavy in the air. Around the long table were school administrators, a few teachers, and the parents of the children who had attacked Ava. Greg Miller was there too, sitting beside his wife, his jaw clenched tight. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the superintendent cleared his throat, offering the kind of polite smile people wear when they're terrified of being recorded. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "we want to express our concern for your daughter's well-being. What happened was unfortunate, but—" Denise cut him off, her tone calm but unyielding. "Unfortunate is spilling coffee on your shirt. What happened to my daughter was a hate-fueled assault, and if this district can't call it what it is, then you're part of the problem." The room fell silent. Even Greg Miller looked up. Carla, seated beside Denise, slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of Ava's injuries, screenshots of social media messages exchanged between the bullies, and written statements from other students who had witnessed the attack. The evidence was undeniable. This wasn't playground teasing, Carla said evenly. This was targeted racial harassment. On school grounds, during school hours, your staff failed to protect this child, and your system failed to respond. The superintendent's composure faltered. He stammered something about policy and the importance of diversity training. Denise leaned forward. You want diversity training? Start by teaching your students that my child's skin is not a threat. Start by showing my daughter that her life matters as much as anyone else's. Across the table, Sandra Miller's eyes filled with tears. Her husband, however, only scoffed. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Kids fight. Kids say stupid things. You're trying to ruin their lives over nothing. Denise turned her gaze on him, steady and unflinching. You're right, she said softly. Kids do learn from somewhere. Maybe it's time they learn something better from you. The room went still again, that kind of silence that comes right before something shifts forever. Then Carla opened another folder. Inside was a formal notice, a pending civil rights complaint against the district, the HOA, and Greg Miller himself. Greg's face drained of color. You'll be receiving your official summons later this week, Carla said firmly. And you can explain to a judge why your son and his friends thought it was acceptable to brutalize a black child while adults stood by. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of the truth and the power of it filled the room like thunder. When Denise finally stood, she looked around at each face, some ashamed, some angry, some just afraid. This isn't just about my daughter, she said quietly. This is about every child who's ever been told they don't belong. And if you think I'm going to stop now, you've underestimated a mother's love. She left the building to the sound of reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing and parents whispering. But she didn't hide. She stood at the top of the school steps, looked directly into the nearest camera, and said what she had held in her heart for weeks. My daughter deserves the same peace, the same safety, and the same respect as every other child here. And if the system won't protect her, I will. The clip aired that evening on nearly every local news channel. Within hours, it was trending across the country. Strangers began sending messages of support, offering legal aid, therapy for Ava, even financial help. Civil rights organizations reached out. The story had grown far beyond Maple Ridge. It had become a mirror for a nation that still refused to face its reflection. And for the first time in weeks, Denise felt something she hadn't dared to feel since that terrible day. Hope. But even hope can be dangerous in a place where change threatens power. Because that night, as Denise tucked Ava into bed, a loud crash shattered their peace once again. A brick came flying through their front window, landing near the sofa. Attached to it was a note, scrawled in jagged letters. Enough noise. Leave, or next time it won't be a warning. Denise stood frozen, glass crunching beneath her feet, the note trembling in her hands. The line between fear and fury blurred inside her. She looked toward her sleeping daughter's room, then back at the shattered glass, and knew this wasn't over. The sound of shattering glass echoed in Denise's ears long after the last shard settled. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, every instinct screaming to grab Ava and run. But something deeper, stronger, anchored her in place. The realization that fear was exactly what they wanted, and she wasn't giving them that satisfaction. She called the police again, but when the same officer from before arrived, disinterested, slow, detached, she knew what would happen before he even spoke. He took a quick note, shrugged, and said, "Probably just some kids messing around again." Denise stared at him, the tremor in her hands replaced by a chilling calm. "Then I guess we'll let the media handle it," she said, walking him to the door. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, surrounded by broken glass, typing with purpose. Her words poured out, not just about the brick, but about every small injustice that had been ignored along the way. The condescension, the looks, the graffiti, the silence. She wrote it all down and hit post. By morning, her story had reached millions. Hashtag Justice for Ava began trending nationwide. Celebrities shared it. Activists amplified it. Families from across the country, Black, white, Latino, Asian, share their own experiences of trying to raise children in communities that looked at them as outsiders. And this time, the authorities couldn't ignore it. The mayor of Maple Ridge issued a public statement condemning the hate crime. The police chief called Denise personally, apologizing for the mishandling of her reports and promising a full investigation. The school district suspended the students involved pending review, and the superintendent offered a public apology. But Denise didn't stop there. She knew systemic change didn't come from apologies. It came from accountability. She partnered with Carla and a group of local civil rights advocates to organize a town hall meeting. For the first time in Maple Ridge's history, people packed the community center not for a festival or bake sale, but to talk about racism in their own backyard. Denise stood on the stage under harsh fluorescent lights, looking out at faces filled with discomfort, guilt, anger, and shame. She could see Greg Miller sitting in the back row, his arms crossed tightly, his pride still shielding him from truth. She took a breath, steady but strong. When I moved here, she began, I believed in this community. I believed my daughter could grow up safe, surrounded by kindness. But what happened to her didn't come out of nowhere. It came from what we refused to talk about, from silence, from excuses, from pretending that racism only exists somewhere else. She paused, scanning the room. When you let a child be bullied for the color of her skin, when you stay quiet while someone sprays hate on your neighbor's wall, you're teaching your own children something too. You're teaching them that cruelty is acceptable as long as it's polite, and that silence is safer than courage. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others looked away. But for the first time, the truth was in the open, undeniable, and heavy. Then, unexpectedly, Sandra Miller, the same woman who once stood by her husband and said nothing, stood up. Her voice trembled as she spoke. My son was one of the boys who hurt Ava, she said quietly. And it wasn't until I saw your story that I realized where he learned that hate from. He learned it from us, from the jokes, the whispers, the looks. I'm sorry. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of a wound finally being acknowledged. Greg rose too, his face red with shame. He didn't speak, just lowered his eyes and walked out the door. Sometimes, silence carries its own confession. In the weeks that followed, Maple Ridge began to change. It was slow, messy, imperfect, but real. The school launched anti-bias programs. The police department implemented cultural sensitivity training, and the HOA created a diversity board. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Denise became a quiet force in her community, not a victim, but a voice. She was invited to speak at schools, to mentor other mothers, and to share her story at national conferences. Ava, once timid and afraid, began to smile again. Her drawings returned to color, bright skies, flowers, friends. One afternoon, a few months later, Denise and Ava were planting flowers in their front yard when a little boy from down the street rode by on his bike. He stopped, hesitated, and said shyly, Hi, Ava, you want to play later? Ava looked up at her mother. Denise smiled. Go on, baby, she said softly. As Ava ran off laughing, Denise looked around the neighborhood. The same houses, the same streets, but something in the air felt lighter. Not fixed, not perfect, but better. She picked up her watering can, letting the water fall over the soil like cleansing rain. Because healing doesn't come from hate being punished. It comes from truth being faced. And though the scars would always remain, Denise knew her daughter had learned something powerful. That strength runs deep in fear, and that love, even when bruised, always finds a way to bloom again. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, she whispered to herself, We belong here, and no one will ever make us forget it again.